thank you all, and thank you, Emily, for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We're delighted to have you. And I just wanted to start out actually asking you not about your new book, which is A Misfits Cinema, which was obviously about the Misfits, but about your last book, Independent Stardom, and how it kind of goes through conversations about labor and contracts, independence, and how it relates to the Misfits. How does this lead to your interest in this film?
Well, I think the connection is Marilyn Monroe and female stars, because like the first book, although 30 years earlier than this, so this is still probably old, at least for our students, right? But it's more modern or contemporary for me. But I think the through line is I became interested in trying to tell a different story about women in Hollywood. I think we hear too often the stories of abuse or the stories of challenges, stories of sexism, and those exist. But I was interested in saying, well, what about the actresses who succeeded or found a way to kind of harness that power to their advantage? So whereas the women I wrote about independent stardom, sort of, they get close. One of them sort of does, one of them has an independent production company, but later, beyond the book, Constance Bennett, and it didn't really last that long. But the women were setting the scene for what Marilyn Monroe and others, like Kim Novak, had her own production company too, and then there were more famous examples, Burt Lancaster's, Kirk Douglas's, and others in the 50s. But I think that's the through line, because Monroe was arguably one of the most popular female star of the studio system. So she takes that agency and uses that to create projects that weren't being offered to her by the studio system, which is sort of the same thing with the women like Carol Lombard and Barbara Stanwyck and Miriam Hopkins and others who I worked with in Independent Stardom.
I think that's the question is how does it differ from this period? What's happening in the late 50s and 60s? And obviously we're going to have a couple of conversations here about old Hollywood, new Hollywood, and this liminal period that you talk about. What's happening in this period about the stars we see on screen and labor contracts on the studio system? Where are we in this moment for the Misfits?
A very different moment from the 30s. So what we see in the 50s, and I wrote about this Independent Stardom, that this is the moment we get up to, is what was sort of niche in the 30s, freelancing, where you aren't bound to a long-term studio contract. Those are on the way out in the 50s. I mean, Monroe was one of the last long-term contract studio stars. And Clark Gable, who we just saw, his last film, basically he got kicked out of MGM. We're like, we can't afford you anymore. I think it was 1954, 55. Him and Robert Taylor. Taylor was actually the longest studio contract star. But basically, Gable becomes a forced freelancer because the studio couldn't afford him in the same way that they had for 20 plus years. So Monroe, basically, when she went on sort of a self-imposed strike from Fox in the mid-50s, when she comes back, she's still under contract with them, but she's able to make outside pictures. And that's, the Misfits is one of those. But so she was an independent agent in the same way that Clark Gable was, Montgomery Clift was, Eli Wallach. But at this point, the studio system is becoming more of a studio distributor system whereby projects financed by talent independently and are distributed through the studio system is what's becoming the norm. And that was the Misfits. And stars often, like Monroe and others, were interested in developing their own projects, which they would kind of sell to a producer, and then that would get distributed through a studio system. So the Misfits is important in that transitional space because of its production process.
I wonder if you could tease out the complicated moment here for Monroe and her original her production company, Arthur Miller, their relationship, writing his only original screenplay. What was the impetus around what Monroe was trying to do with her career? What was Miller trying to do for Monroe? How did they get together? And obviously what the connection is with Reno. There's a whole complicated history which I would love for you to share. So give us some context for the film we just saw.
Yeah, I have to tell my students, like there's a reason why she's in Reno getting a divorce. Do you guys realize that that's where you went to get a fast divorce? Up until about the 60s, sort of the moment I think where it starts to change, where it becomes more accessible to get a divorce, and the other at the time, 47 states, or soon to be 50. But Arthur Miller, he'd actually met Monroe earlier in the 50s, but by, I think, around when she left Hollywood basically to protest her situation at Fox, and she went to study at the Actors Studio and was hanging around in New York going to plays, that's when their affair really started to happen. But he went to Reno to get a divorce from his first wife to Marilyn Monroe, and the impetus for the movie, it started as a short story. It was called Chicken Feed. It was published in Esquire, I think in 1957. But he didn't necessarily think about turning that into a screenplay right away. It was when Marilyn Monroe, I think, had I don't know which miscarriage it was. She had a couple with him, but he was moved to try to soothe her grief after a miscarriage in 1957 to turn this into a screenplay. So, but the other impetus was creative, to provide for her a dramatic role because she wasn't getting those roles. I mean, if you watch Bus Stop, which was the first film that was produced by Marilyn Monroe Productions, distributed by Fox, there's moments of it in there, directed by Joshua Logan, and then The Prince and the Showgirl, very interesting production, also produced by Marilyn Monroe Productions, but she's still a comedic actress, I think, in those. So this was an opportunity to give her something that she was not getting through Hollywood. And I think that Monroe was a bit strategic. I mean, I do think that the love was genuine, but I think, he was one of the most foremost playwrights. He was associated with the method actors, and he won a Pulitzer Prize. He was probably the forefront intellectual coming out of New York. I think there was a conscious strategic move here too. I'm going to align myself with this because what's happening in Hollywood is not working for me in the same way. So, but this wasn't produced by Marilyn Monroe Productions, so even though it was a project created for her by Miller, Marilyn Monroe Productions did not produce this. So.
And the situation of Reno, or I should say the location of Reno, really becomes a character in the film. And so it's not just that, of course, they end up there because of the divorce and the complicated relationship. It's also that Reno itself becomes a character in the film. How much was that a conscious decision, and how much did Reno really play a part in the Misfits?
I think if you look at Miller's autobiography, and there's several interviews towards the last decade of his life where he's reflecting on this experience, he was quite taken with Reno. I think that he thought there was something interesting and unique. He says it more eloquently than me, but there was something about the people who live there. I mean, I think, my husband, who's from Reno, who's here tonight, always says, you don't go to Reno, you end up in Reno. And I think that Miller, again, he says it more eloquently, I think he realized that. And he was inspired by the real life cowboys, he called them. He met some cowboys that are modeled on the three in this movie that were the impetus for Chicken Feed and what became the Misfits. But what he said in a couple, more than one interview, and also in his autobiography, is that what really astounded him was they were the real cowboys, and yet they didn't view themselves that way. They view themselves as the facsimiles. The real cowboys are in the movies. And he found this completely heartbreaking and also mind-boggling. It's you really are the cowboys, but yet you don't even identify with this. So I think he was taken with he was also very inspired by the parched landscape, which is why I think the last 30 minutes is arguably, for me, the most powerful part of the movie. He talked about, he wanted the film to have the look of drying bones, because that's what the desert to him, struck against those parched mountains. That's the feel that he had when he was living. He was living near Pyramid Lake, so outside of Reno. He had to go into town when he wanted to get his mail and things like that. But so the landscape and the people he met who were trying to live off the land or had made compromises because they couldn't do it anymore were the impetus of this. So if you know Reno and you read his writings about it and the original short story, I think you can understand this arguably the biggest character in the film.
So did you end up in Reno? Did you go to Reno to do your research? And I know you did, so you'll answer that. But I guess the other question is, what's left? So if I were to go to Reno today, or if someone in the audience went to Reno, what could I see that was in this movie? What locations could I visit?
Well, one of the ways really that started this project was there's a short documentary you could watch that actually takes you there. It's called Misfit Landscape. And it came out, I think, about 10 years ago. But that documentary filmmaker came to me asking, they actually went to my dissertation chair at UCLA, who said, you don't want to talk to me, you want to talk to my former student. But I immediately was interested, because I'm married into a Reno family, I understand what this film means. So what she goes to the sites now and then juxtaposes them to the original ones. But when they're on the playa, that last important sequence in the movie, the last 30 minutes, actually became christened the Misfits Flats because of this movie. Now, I don't know if it's, I'd have to look I think you could do a Google Maps thing. I think it is called that, but it wasn't that before. So that's still there, and it looks almost, I haven't been there, I think it's been about 7 years. But it looks just like it does in the movie. And then in Dayton, Ohio, Dayton, Nevada, that's where they filmed the rodeo, which is not where the Reno rodeo was taking place, but that's where Huston decided to recreate it. Dayton's a pretty sleepy town, but it's still there. And the courthouse, I was just having this conversation at dinner before, the beautiful courthouse when Monroe walks up and rejects Kevin McCarthy, that is still there. But I think the most iconographic landmark that is not in the film, but was very important for the production, and talking to my in-laws and people who grew up in Reno around this time when the movie was being made, the Mapes Hotel, which was the hotel to go to, and that's where that's where everybody was put up. There's all these notes in the memos about the cast and crew staying there, and that is not there anymore. It's gone. So that's a landmark that wasn't important in the film, but was for the production, and is no longer there. But the Truckee River and the beautiful part of them when they throw the rings, or Thelma Rider's telling Marilyn to throw her ring into the river, but there's still those bridges, and that's still a beautiful part of downtown Reno. So.
And between Arthur Miller's writing and John Huston's direction, what's the kind of signature Huston trademarks we can see in the film, and what kind of interplay or tension do you see in the two creators working?
Well, the Huston part of the film is the second part of the film, when you get outside. And the first part of the film, that is more verbose and in more interior shots, is the Miller influence. For Huston, there's an epigraph for the chapter I'm looking at, kind of this called misfit authorship between, it started out, I thought it was going to be this tension between Miller and Huston, but then it really just became a Miller thing, which I could talk about in a minute. But Huston, there's a quote I found where he said, if I have any signature at all, it's that I'm, basically on location. So really, after World War II, most of his films are shot on location. I think of The Treasure of Sierra Madre might be one of the most famous ones. So I think once you're outside, particularly in the last 35 minutes of the film, leading up to the Mustang capturing and freeing of them, that's where I think you feel John Huston the most, and outside and dealing with nature, and that kind of tension between quote-unquote progress, right, between man and this questioning if it's really progress, and the way that he juxtaposes the close-ups of the horses and the cowboys and Monroe's protest. And then the other part of the film kind of leading up to that is a bit more verbose, and I think can be slow at times, at least for 2026 viewing. But where I think there's more attempts to tell instead of show is the playwright influence, that's coming from Miller. And what's really interesting is that particularly in the international reviews coming out of South America and Europe, and they picked up on this tension too, and talked about, I think there's a quote from a Parisian reviewer saying, there are two films in this, and they I think it translates, they hate each other, or they're misaligned or something. So that's what's interesting, is that it was more kind of baffling for American critics, but that tension's picked up in the reviews abroad, which is interesting, I think.
Speaking of the tension in Europe, one of the things that I'd love you to talk about is just the kind of fascinating thing that you talk about is the way this film is positioned in terms of eras. We talk about, again, to return to a conversation we had a few minutes ago, which is about classical Hollywood and new Hollywood and the place of Misfits, and people also placing it usually in this moment. But you've really found a way to think about this movie as a way to really get into all of the kind of shifts that are happening in Hollywood at this time period, independent production, as well as influences for European art cinema. I wonder if you can kind of place the film in that period, talk about all the different kind of swirling influences and trajectories that are happening at that moment.
I will try. I'll try to keep it concise. Yeah, I think something that also connects to my first book, where I try to look at the 20th century and through Hollywood through a historical continuum instead of these ruptures and breaks, because it's in transition. It's not like suddenly like, oh, here's the new Hollywood and edgy stuff happening. Like, no, we're building to that. So I think it's, we're looking at a film that is in the early 60s, and like I mentioned, the production of it in itself is indicative of the shift. And it's not, some critics have talked about, they think the power landed with Gable, because he was the highest paid. The lion's share, like almost $1 million of its $4 million budget went to Gable. I think it was like just shy, it's like 700 to 800,000 something. He got paid more because of it took long, overshoots or shooting over, but Arthur Miller is the true, the one who had the most creative control. Like, he had the ability to change the screenplay as much as he wanted. Huston did not even have, Huston was supposed to keep him under control, but Miller still had the ability to write as much as he wanted and change as much as he wanted. This is why we get a higher budget. But I think that yes, talent was getting more control, but I find this remarkable, you have to agree, but for a screenwriter and a first-time screenwriter of an original screenplay to have that much leverage. But it's really Monroe, he basically leverages his relationship with Monroe to get that. I mean, that's how he got it. I don't think he really says it that bluntly, but that's what I ascertain. So it's a star-driven picture, but the person who had the most agency in that production behind the scenes is Arthur Miller. But I kind of place it within that shift. That really germinates in the new Hollywood with directors. But in this instance, it's with Miller. And it's distributed by United Artists, which at that point had already branded itself as a distributor of, edgy or different, off the beat, independent productions or talent who wouldn't take risks. And the Western part of it, like, this is not a typical Western. It's something different, and I think we're sort of already building to what becomes the revisionist Western, but I think that's something that makes this a transitional film too. Like, in its investigation and questioning of the values of the Western, the values of manifest destiny, the values of quote unquote, progress, but at the same time, well, wait, what does it mean to live off, to not have wages, right? That's the theme. Like, to, exploit the land, to, kill animals, like, is that really a way to live too? So I think that moral questioning, I mean, there's a happy ending. I don't know if you really buy it. There's a story behind that too. But I think, and that's the old Hollywood part of it. It tries to kind of nicely tie it all together and have a romantically happy ending with this couple that's rekindled. It's like, well, do you really think this is going to work out? Having a baby and getting finally accepting that wages is the best thing. So it's all of this is what makes it, I think, an interesting production that's indicative of these shifts. Because there's so many interesting films that are coming out in the late 50s, early 60s. I think at least when we first got to UCLA, I feel like it was like, oh, in Hollywood, they didn't know what they were doing. They're making these ridiculous, over-budget epics or musicals. Nothing really landed. It's like, no, there's some really interesting films, you know, like Kubrick's making Paths of Glory, Lolita, Dr. Strangelove, you know, Blake Edwards, Days of Wine and Roses. I'm trying to think, McKendrick's, the one with Burt Lancaster, shot by James Wong Howe. The Sweet Smell of Success, late 50s. I mean, if you start digging here, because I've taught a couple classes just this sort of transitional couple years, there's so many interesting films that are showing where American cinema fully flowers just less than a decade later. And this is one of them, I think.
Yeah, and one of the things that's really legendary about this film is that supposedly, right, it's Clark Gable's last film.
Yeah.
He died 10 days after it was shot. It's Marilyn Monroe's last film. So I'm curious, like, you know, one of the things that people remember about this film, of course, is those two pieces of information, but that everyone is kind of aging in the film, and Hollywood is aging in this period. I'm curious about your sense of not just how it's remembered, but how it's misremembered, and how the film holds all of this information, but yet some of that information has almost overwhelmed its legacy. Curious about that.
Well, I completely agree that the legacy has been that it's one of tragedy in a way. Because of, I mean, Gable didn't know this was going to be his last movie. I don't even think Marilyn Monroe knew this was going to be. She definitely did not think this was going to be her last movie. And I think that has really framed the way we remember the Misfits. But this misfit framing, if I may use that, is I think if you even Google it, it's like, oh, it was a disappointment. And if you really probe that further, I think it gets into this impossible formula of Hollywood economics, right? That it was the most expensive black and white picture up to that point. I have no idea what the rate of inflation, but $4 million is a lot of money for 1961. But especially for when I was studying the reception, if you look at the trades, which I did, and look at the production notes, which I was able to because the artist's collection is at Wisconsin, so I can see distribution earnings. Because it was Clark Gable's last movie, it made a lot of money. Also, the Millers are done by the end of this production, so I think a lot of people were motivated to go see, but what's this movie that led to the end of that marriage? So it made a lot of money in the US, at least, but it didn't make enough money to make this a mega hit. So the idea that it was a disappointment is just not true, because it didn't get a lot of. I actually think Gable deserved a posthumous Oscar nomination. I thought it was one of the most complex performances he turned in his career, but he didn't get much Oscar love. But it's a film that was seen and did have a big impact in that first moment. There's all this, you would appreciate this for your exhibition historian. There's all this, it debuted in February 1961, and it's talking there's some crazy snowstorm in the Northeast, and how the crowd still came instead of the snow, and to Radio City Music Hall and such. So it shows to this moment where Gable was still a huge draw, and that is something that came up internationally. Like every review I looked at talked about Gable dying. And it's interesting because I hadn't really thought of him being a global superstar in the way that we think of Hollywood movie stars now, and he was. Monroe made sense to me. But it was really the Gable show, looking at the reviews. And I think that was something that was quite interesting. I hope I'm answering your question.
No, absolutely. No, you raised something that I wanted to ask you earlier, but I moved past because we're on a roll. But I want to just read a list of the sources you use, because I think it's instructive for people who are working on books like this. And how do you construct a movie, take a movie like this and construct a book out of it? You looked at, these are the following things. I'm reading this. Contracts, legal documents, studio memos, distribution materials, personal correspondences, industry trades, interviews with cast and crew, publicity material, print journalism, film reviews, screenplay drafts, and annotations, and I'm sure there's 5 other things that you looked at. I'm just curious, of course you did on the ground field research. So, doing all that, how do you put together a book like this? Because you can't go interview the people who worked on it, but you have all this different swirling kind of narratives and impacts on the film. How do you construct a book that's using the conversation around New Hollywood and Old Hollywood and independent stardom, how do you take all that material and turn it into something coherent that makes a real impact on the field, as I know it's going to when it comes out?
Well, I hope so. Thank you. I will answer that, but I will say I did get to interview one person who's still alive.
Great.
The script supervisor, Angela Allen. I got to interview her twice, or maybe 3 times. She's still alive, and she was Houston's script supervisor from the African Queen through to the early 80s. So yeah, she's amazing. But so I did get to interview one person, which is pretty cool. And you know, those quotes, well, when I was able to work her in, I did. But that was only one person out of a very big production crew and cast. Well, I think for me, the way the book, and my editor, Thomas Schatz, was really instrumental in helping me think about how this could, how the Misfits could be the nexus from which to zoom out. So I think about, I don't know, you know, if it would work here or somewhere in LA, I think about how a film series could be really interesting when the book comes out to program in films from the cast and talent that's involved, to sort of demonstrate how it kind of crystallizes in the Misfits, but the ways in which what the talent and where Hollywood was at that time is the way to kind of go outward from. So the Misfit, when I kind of thought, okay, I can do this. Yeah, it's one film. It's going to be easy. If you just read that list, I was like, oh yeah, I guess that's why it's taken years to get, almost a decade to get this going, and hopefully done soon. But it became an organizing principle because, yeah, to start looking at all of those other films I was mentioning, for example, it just becomes, you know, a bit too. Well, you could do it because you do big books, not me. But I thought this is an interesting concept to really delve deeply into one film to look at the nexus of these changes that are happening at the end of the old Hollywood and the dawn of the new Hollywood. But to your point, that list, this is something I'm really interested in because of my work as a historian. This is not all in one place. You know, you and I teach this stuff, so I always tell students, like, there's maybe one place for a certain number of films, the Warner Brothers archive, only for 40 years of the Warner Brothers studio that you could do this. There would be all the materials. But I had to really do this, not even triangulating, it became bigger. So, you know, it started with Houston, when I went to go research for that short documentary, and his stuff's at the Herrick. And then I knew the United Artists stuff was in Wisconsin, and that's where the UA, but that's mostly distribution and financial agreements, stuff that I'm really interested in, but that's only one side of the story. Not all the talents agreements are there because it was a freelance project. And Frank Taylor, the producer, who was really a publishing guy, but Miller knew him and liked him, and he had produced one film from MGM in the late 40s, so he was the producer. His stuff is at Indiana University. Peter Labuza, a friend of ours in Carman, tipped me off on that. So, and that ended up being really awesome. Like that's a very rich collection, but I had no idea that he even had papers. And then the Miller stuff is at Harry Ransom Center, and that's really interesting because I went in 2017 and thought I had kind of crossed that off, but then more was either accessioned or opened, or the Miller estate sent more over. So right before COVID, more stuff came. And that was interesting, kind of dealing with that remote research thing. I ordered some stuff, and then I went back 3 years ago now. And then I found out during a research demo with my students for the Margaret Herrick, and I was just sort of demoing, like, okay, students, let's look up my project. And Thelma Ritter stuff was there, and that was an acquisition over COVID. I'm like, well, now I have more stuff, which is a good problem to have. But it was interesting, and I went to the Nevada Historical Society, which is at University of Nevada at Reno, to kind of look at their clipping files and what things they had. And then there's all the autobiographies and the biographies and the oral histories, which was fun to read, but and that stuff was mostly based in Los Angeles. Am I missing anything? Because things kept popping up, which was fascinating to me. There's probably more. I didn't go to the New York Public Library, where I hear they have wonderful Monty Cliff scrapbooks and such. Oh yeah, I am missing something. The Eli Wallach and Ann Jackson collection was donated in the midst of this project. So it was kind of, but the point is it's not all in place. So this triangulating and sleuthing of sources for one movie. You know, I also wanted to have a larger historiographical aim that I can make this claim around the Misfits because I found the stuff, right, to back it up. And there might be more compelling films that show this transition, but does it have the paper trail? And if you and I know as historians, if I can't show it with hard evidence, then I don't have a story to tell. You know.
And so, just so we're talking about process, we had a conversation, as I often do with people who I bring to the stage, which is that I was watching the film and noticed the George Nelson title sequence and asked you about it because, you know, I know the George Nelson name, but not from title sequences, you know, Salt Bass and many others. But so we get this very modernist title sequence from the guy whose firm often did, you know, furniture and design, including like the Transamerica logo. What does that modernist title sequence do for a Western? How does it sort of, like, I think it sort of announces already we're going to see something different. So what is this that George Nelson was working on with this film with Miller and Huston?
Well, this I really owe to you for pointing it out to me because I'm not the connoisseur of modernist design that you are, or my husband is for that matter. But I think you're absolutely right that sets the tone. Like this is not John Ford's West, okay? This is not The Searchers. This is not even The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, a equally important earlier visionist Western that comes out the following year. But I do think it sets the tone, and I think I told you, you piqued my interest to look further into that because there is a short article I've committed to for another anthology. I'm like, well, maybe this is what I open it with because it's not in the book yet. But I think that immediately, and plus the soundtrack too, like it's more in tune with the serious drama, like edgy dramas, you know, something out of John Frankenheimer or Blake Edwards. This is not seems synonymous with the Western, but I think it immediately sets the tone that this is not what it's inverting your expectations.
More Misfits.
Yeah, Misfit title sequence, like and the puzzle, you know, sort of this metaphor to accentuate that they are Misfits, literally misfit puzzle pieces. But I'm going to look more into that because if I had to guess, I feel like that's a Miller thing, or maybe Frank Taylor. You know, these New York, you know, men of design. I don't know.
It's very Mad Men.
But it's and I remember the first time I watched it, I remember thinking too, like, this isn't Saul Bass. And then, you probed it further and went with this.
Well, you know. I wasn't not expecting to see George Nelson rewatching the film. I guess before we turn it over to questions, I guess the question is thinking through all the various forces swirling around here between the independence, the stardom, the aging stardom, the reputation, the liminal space of the film. How do you hope the film is remembered? If people are thinking about it 10, 20, 30 years from now, what do you want people to take away from the Misfits seeing it this time and reading your book? What do you hope they kind of see it anew and not just have this kind of tired conversation about this is the last film of Clark Gable and Marilyn Monroe?
Wow, that's a good question. Well, I think that what I would like them, I'd like that the story, there's a more complicated and interesting contextual story that surrounds this production. Like sometimes the stories behind the movies are more compelling than the actual movie, although I do think this is an interesting movie. But yeah, it's much more than Marilyn Monroe and Clark Gable's last movie, even though every time I talk about this project to someone, that's how I frame it, because I know they'll know who Marilyn Monroe is. But especially thinking about it as this turning point, I think, you know, for the United States, this is the end of the economic boom. We're on the dawn of the civil rights era, we're on the dawn of second wave feminism, we're on the dawn of the environmental movement. We're in that moment where we're kind of questioning the legacy of Manifest Destiny. And we're starting, I mean, Westerns are never the same moving from the 60s on. I mean, it's like a given now. It's going to be a Western that's interrogating the legacy of the 19th century Manifest Destiny. So I think that, and this film is also interesting in its questioning, I think, of our place in the modern world. Like, what is it really all about wages? You know, is there something, you know, should there be compassion for for animals? Should there be compassion for the misfits, those that have not found their way in the so-called middle class prescripted life of success, grounded by consumerism, grounded by acquisition of money and children, things like that. Like all of our misfit characters here are truly misfits in that middle class society, which is something I think Miller was, that's how it's an Arthur Miller project. You know, that inquisitive, like that, what is the American dream? Like you see traces of Willy Loman, I think a little bit in our misfits here. But I think that this is a film that is sort of questioning where the country goes without even knowing where we've gone. So I think it's a film that's quite profound in what it was, what Miller was thinking about these larger questions that, you know, I don't know, for better or for worse, like have come to fruition, you know?
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much. We're going to turn it over to him in the Q&A.
I wonder if you might talk a little more about the connection between Miller and Monroe and method acting in the period. The other two actors, not Clark Gable, but the other two are also in that tradition, Montgomery Clift and Ilya. And then where does John Huston fit in this as well? Because he had, by the mid-1950s, become very well known for his interest in psychology, coming out of Let There Be Light, having made it, and having it suppressed, and then Freud, that he had made Freud. Is there something there that you find that coalesces in terms of what's distinctive about the Misfits?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I have a whole chapter that looks at this unique amalgamation of mid-century acting styles. And as you mentioned, Miller sort of being known as a playwright whose plays were put on stage by method actors. So I'm assuming if anyone thought, you know, if you were thinking who's the most method in this movie, you wouldn't think Marilyn Monroe. But I feel I make a persuasive case, as do some of the feminist writings that are rethinking Marilyn Monroe and her place in mid-century method acting. But if you think about it, like Marlon Brando, who is often cited as the most, you know, forefront example of American method acting, he never even studied with Lee Strasberg. He was a Stella Adler, and quite vocal that that's who he was not a disciple of Lee Strasberg. But Marilyn Monroe was the forefront studio movie actress who was at the actor's studio. And especially the scene where she's talking to Thelma Ritter about how her mother was not there. You know, you understand she was not there. You know, this idea she's taking her own life experience and using that emotion to channel the feeling of her character, which is what, if there's any, you know, Lee Strasberg disciples, pardon me if I'm summarizing it wrong, I've found out there's a lot of strong feelings around the Strasberg acting, but that to me is where you see her channeling that approach. And I think it's fascinating. There's a couple films around this time where you have, you know, the modern actors, like the modern acting that was really disseminated on a large scale by people like Clark Gable and Bette Davis and Barbara Stanwyck, et cetera. The sound cinema really dispelled that. So, but around this time you have, you know, you've got Montgomery Clift is sort of a bridge between them. He was branded as a method actor, but he, you know, he was coming out of that transition of the modern stage to method and screen. But he's not a method actor in the way that Eli Wallach is. And so I think it's so fascinating to look at and then we have Thelma Ritter, who is a Hollywood character actress, and she's there for comedic relief. But we have Ritter and Gable, who are modern actors, and then we have kind of a transitionary actor, Montgomery Clift, and then we have the two most method are Wallach and Monroe. And if you've watched this movie as much as I have, and you probably have too, Jack, you just think about how physical or grimacing Wallach is. Like and Monroe, the fidgeting and moving her hands when she's nervous, or her hair, like these are these mannerisms. So I think it's a compelling film to think about that the mixture of acting styles. And there's a couple from this period, like East of Eden is another one I think of too. So for Huston, that's so interesting. I hadn't, made the connection with Let There Be Light and his interest in, I hadn't obviously know about that, but I didn't see any evidence of his interest in psychology, at least on the paper trail. But I can share with you that Monroe only agreed to do the movie if he would direct it when he came up. Yeah, because she'd had a positive experience with him 10 years before in The Asphalt Jungle, which was, one of her kind of breakthrough parts. And that she, at one point, so Miller was really nervous if Huston didn't agree, what were they going to do? Because she had said, well, it's him or nothing. And even there's some really interesting quotes from Huston where he says, that there was something about her that she would go deep down inside to channel, something inside her that she would channel to bring forth this performance that he hadn't seen in other, that was unique to her. And he also mentioned how in Europe they were much sooner to recognize her talent. Whereas here, she was sort of dismissed as, a body and a sex symbol. So that's something that came up again and again in my research with him and my interviews with him. So, and both Miller and Huston had this mutual admiration for Italian neorealism. And I know it's interesting because you might think this is not like a neorealist production, but that was something that they were inspired in their collaboration to try to bring into this different type of American movie production. Except it does have Marilyn Monroe in it, right?
Was this talked about with the press at the time? The relationship between acting styles and the different players that are involved in the production?
Yeah, so they do, maybe not in the germane terms that we are right now, but I would say the American press was much more skeptical and dismissive of Monroe's supposed method acting. But you see, I'm thinking, because I was just looking through it for something I'm going to present on later, or talk about later in a symposium later this year. But the Greek press, for example, was very complimentary and praised Monroe's performance and talked about it. This is what she's been doing. Studying the method, working with Strasberg. But they were more pejorative here. And like I said, Gable and his being his last movie was mentioned almost in every review, whether they liked the movie or not. But there was a cognizance that there was a unique mixture of acting styles, like you mentioned Eli Wallach, and he was sort of known as a New York stage actor, a method disciple, and Clift had that following him too, his reputation. Although we have this is his second act, right? This is a different Clift than the beginning of the 50s. Yeah. Thank you for a good question.
Hi. I really enjoyed the cinematography and the sound design, and I was just wondering if these technical elements were typical of the time period, and in general, what some standout features of the film were to you.
I love that you noticed the cinematography, because that's Russell Meddy, who had done some work with Douglas Sirk before this. And his cinematography was mentioned a lot in the reception by reviewers for its kind of realistic and at times haunting quality, especially the outdoor sequences. And the sound design, you're giving me something, the book's not in final press yet, so I should maybe think about that more. But with it being on location, I think it is a more, it's both. It's unique, but also there were more and more on-location productions at this time. So I think the fact that the film was conceived to be shot on location in Reno and these important exterior shots, that became even more an important part of the film. But the cinematography, I mean, I love watching the cinematography myself. It makes the film, especially when they're leaving the rodeo, and she's, when she cries help, and you're just like, yes, please. But the way that it shifts from kind of this, like the popular photojournalistic magazine Life, that sort of like the photojournalistic realism when they're outside, but then also to kind of have that chiaroscuro kind of haunting moments of unease that we kind of linger at, and you get uncomfortable, and then it keeps moving, so you can't really get too uncomfortable, But I agree with you, and it's quite effective. And people noticed his touch at the time too. It was touted in most reviews. Like I said, even if they didn't like the film, they still liked Russell Meddy.
Earlier you mentioned the film's ending and how kind of bittersweet it is, and I'm just wondering if you came across anything interesting in your research specifically related to the ending.
I'm so glad you asked that question, because there is a big story behind that, yes. And I was thinking towards the end of this, like, I didn't get to talk about that. So, yeah, there's a story behind the ending. So was anyone unconvinced that did it seem like, really? Like you just had that huge protest and he, was kind of despicable to you, and you're just gonna go have a kid with him now and it's okay? So if you were a little skeptical, okay. So what's interesting in the Miller archives is there's so many drafts. There's so many. I'm not even sure. I mean, I went through all the full drafts, but in terms of the fragments and deleted scenes, and I mean, that was a whole nother. I was like, I'll deal with that later. So the first draft that was written in 1957, the first draft of this, and this is the screenplay that I know, or I deduced John Huston read. And then it changes in 59 when Gable and other people get on board. But it changed before they got on board. So she does not leave with Gay. She leaves with Peirce. And doesn't that completely kind of change the vibe, right? And that was the first version that that they read at UA. Max Junstein, the producer, became the kind of the champion of the project. Miller talks a lot about how he couldn't quite figure how to end it. But it is a little eerie that as the production waged on, and as, because he kept changing it in production too. But it shifts to sort of her reconciling with Gay in different forms in 59. And then, like I said, it keeps evolving really up until October 1960. And that's when the marriage is on the rocks. So I'm like, this is interesting how we end up going with the old guy and the guy who's emblematic of the Old West and kind of the father figure. And she's not going with the young guy who's questioning. And in the first screenplay draft, Peirce, it's much more open and siding with her and defying Gay. And even Guido is sort of pulled in to kind of align himself more with them than Gay, whereas Guido sort of seems like Gay's buddy in this one. So, but I think that's like wild, like, if it ended that way. I mean, I think it'd be really wild if she had left with none of them. She just did her own thing. But that was to me sort of an aha moment when I was in Texas first looking at those screenplays. I was like, wait a minute, like this. And if you've gone down a rabbit hole like I have, so a lot of the published sort of fan stuff or biographies or kind of just film buff critic stuff doesn't really delve into that. I understand why, because I had to deal with a lot of pages. And I never really read screenplays like this. Like, I guess I was kind of doing script analysis, but to sort of look, and luckily Miller was a pack rat and kept all this stuff, and we can look at it. But it's interesting. But then I realized it's just as interesting a story as to how it evolved to what it became. But if you aren't convinced or you're a little skeptical, well, it makes sense now. I wonder what that would have been like if it had been that movie. But it was quite baffling to UA in particular when it changed. They didn't find it as convincing. And in the book, I cite those memos, and you can get to the pinpointing points by these producers and other people who were questioning that decision. But they couldn't undo anything because Miller had the creative contractual right to do as he pleased with the screenplay, and he did.
Please help me welcome. Say that again. It's been a long day. Please help me thank Emily Carman for being here, and look for her book, A Misfits Cinema, coming soon. Thank you so much
for having me. It was a pleasure.